and welcome to the Talk About Teddy podcast, conversations exploring the world of Theodore Roosevelt. I'm your host, Kurt Skinner, and I'm joined by my good friend and co-host, Larry Marple. During his 7.5 years as president, Theodore Roosevelt established 5 national parks and our nation's first 18 national monuments. Larry and I are going to be looking at all of TR's parks in a 4-part series, beginning today with the Pacific coastal states of Washington, Oregon, and California. And joining us on this 4-part tour is National Park Service veteran and friend of the podcast, Valerie Naylor. So, let's get started.
Today we have our good friend, retired superintendent from the Theodore Roosevelt National Park and 31-year veteran of the National Park Service, Valerie Naylor, back with us. Good to have you with us, Valerie.
Thank you very much.
Welcome back. This is going to be your third episode appearance on the Talk About Teddy podcast.
Well, as I always say, I like to talk about Theodore Roosevelt and I like to talk about national parks, so it works out well.
Well, Valerie, we sure appreciate your willingness to come back, and we've been talking together, right, about how we'd like to proceed with what we're going to call the Theodore Roosevelt National Park Series, and we're going to be looking at them regionally and considering today's episode, the Pacific Coastal State Parks, to be part 1, right?
Right, and they all have something in common besides just being on the Pacific coast, so it'll be great to put them together here. Perhaps starting with the first one that was established in the Pacific coast.
All right, so what's Theodore Roosevelt's very first national park? And we got to think that's going to be a big deal for Roosevelt.
Well, I'd like to remind listeners that Theodore Roosevelt established 18 national monuments and 5 national parks during his time as president. The very first national park that he established was Crater Lake in Oregon in May of 1902. So we can start with that one.
Okay, excellent. Maybe we'll start with, why in the world do we call it a crater lake?
Well, it started out as Mount Mazama. See, I grew up in Oregon, so I went to school in Oregon, elementary school, high school, and first 4 years of college. And so every kid in Oregon learns about Mount Mazama. It was 12,000 feet high, and then about 7,700 years ago, it erupted, and then it formed this big crater, which now has a lake in it. So it's Crater Lake. It's hard to believe that all happened like that, but it did.
So what makes Crater Lake unique out of all the thousands of lakes in America that would cause Roosevelt to think this is national park worthy?
Well, first of all, when you first see it, it's just amazing. The color of the water is very pure. And then that round crater that holds it, and it's got an island in the middle. It is just incredible. But also, it is the deepest lake in the United States, and the 7th deepest in the world, at about 1,943 feet is average, I believe. And so it's just massive. And when you see it, the color blue in photos, it's just always incredible.
So how did the Crater Lake come on Theodore Roosevelt's radar to be saved?
A lot of parks, not all, but a lot of them have champions. And sometimes that is an individual, sometimes it's a landowner, sometimes it's a group, sometimes it's a congressperson or a senator. But a lot of parks have somebody that wants that park to happen so bad that they work really hard at it. And one of the big champions of Crater Lake was William Gladstone Steele. He heard about it. He had lived in Kansas. He went to Oregon. It took him a while before he ever saw it. But then he worked for 17 years to try to get it established as a national park. But it wasn't all just William Steele. There's also William Franklin Arrant, who was actually later the first superintendent of the park. He worked towards it too. And then Steele and Arrant sort of had a falling out. And it got very complicated after 10 years when Steele tried to get Arrant removed from his post as superintendent. But that's a whole nother story. And in the archives that I studied there for the Theodore Roosevelt Center at Dickinson State University, there were lots of letters that went back and forth from Steele and others to try to convince Gifford Pinchot and Theodore Roosevelt to make it a national park.
You'd mentioned this earlier when you were working with the Theodore Roosevelt Center in Dickinson to go out and look in all the archives of the various parks that were TR related. So what was it that you found?
Well, Crater Lake had quite a lot. They had some that was actually in their archives, and their archivist was nice enough to actually digitize all of that for us because she didn't want anyone else to handle it. But I also went in the library of the park, and I was able to find some other interesting things, including big controversies over some sort of funny things. There's a photo, a well-known photo of some men sitting on rocks at Crater Lake. And one of them looks a lot like Theodore Roosevelt. He has the right glasses and haircut and everything, the right build, right clothes. And for a long time, people thought it was Theodore Roosevelt. And the newspaper went back and forth about it, and all these people weighed in. And finally, it was determined it was definitely not Theodore Roosevelt. He was never at Crater Lake, ever. But this picture sort of made it look like he had been. And so there was just a lot there with the newspaper clippings. Was it he or wasn't he? And all of that. And a lot of fun there. But also these letters that went back and forth to try to get Theodore Roosevelt to establish it as a national park. Because these people really wanted it to happen. Now, a lot of times when parks are proposed, not only are there champions, but there are people that do not want it to be a park. And that's usually someone that wants to use the area for a shorter term gain. I don't know too much about that at Crater Lake, though. So I think that it had a good chance from the beginning of becoming Theodore Roosevelt's first national park. And of course, it takes an act of Congress to establish a national park. So he signed the bill. It's interesting, of his 18 parks and monuments, some of them he was very much involved and was very knowledgeable about them. And others, it was more of just a signature kind of a thing. And that's true really for all parks and monuments, whether the president at the time really is engaged or just signing off on a bill that happens to have something in it. But in the case of Crater Lake, he was well aware because he got a lot of letters from these folks trying to get him to make it a park. I don't know that there was a lot of opposition to Crater Lake. Really were more people that were for it. There was a hiking group, and it still exists, called the Mazamas, and they required in those days certain things of their members. Not just anyone could join. You had to have climbed a glaciated peak and all these things.
Oh, wow.
And they offered Theodore Roosevelt an honorary membership in the Mazamas, and they sent him a letter, and he didn't answer it, as if the president sits around and answers letters inviting him to join a group, right? But then William Gladstone Steele sent him another letter and said, we sent you this letter and you didn't reply. And I'm sending it to you again. And then people got mad at him for doing that because they said that really wasn't appropriate to do that with the President of the United States. And then there were some people in the Mazamas that felt that Theodore Roosevelt didn't really qualify and shouldn't be allowed in the group. Although I know that he climbed the Matterhorn on his honeymoon. Yeah. So I'm thinking that should have qualified him. But now today, the Mazamas still exist, but they have removed the glaciated peak requirement from their list of things that you have to do to be a member. And so many people can join now.
Yeah, well, I certainly would agree that T.R. Shirley earned membership based on his ascent of the Matterhorn Glacier. He climbed that with pretty minimalist equipment less than 20 years after the first known ascent. So what's next, Valerie, on our road trip of T.R.'s Pacific Coastal Parks and Monuments?
So the next two were national monuments in California. And those were Lassen Peak and Cinder Cone. And both of them were about 2 sections of land each. And Lassen Peak is an amazing mountain, great for climbing. And so folks wanted that preserved. And then Cinder Cone protects the cinder cone and then a lot of the lava down below. But they're not adjacent exactly. And so they were both established at the same time, back when Theodore Roosevelt proclaimed them, but it's sort of been forgotten that. And now, because Lassen Volcanic National Park is all one, and it incorporates both of those national monuments. Everybody thinks about it being established in 1916, but it was really Theodore Roosevelt that got it started there in 1907.
So we're looking at these chronologically as opposed to just moving down as if we're on a road trip. So we've moved from Crater Lake in Oregon down to Northern California for these two national monuments at the site of a what had been a dormant volcano.
What is funny about that is that the proclamation that Theodore Roosevelt signed for Cinder Cone said it was to protect the important feature and the adjacent lava field, as well as two small lakes. And the proclamation for Lassen Volcanic, or Lassen Peak, said that it marked the southern terminus of the long line of extinct volcanoes in the Cascade Range. And it's of special importance in tracing the history of the volcanic phenomena of that vicinity. So that was in 1907. And then in 1914, Lassen Peak erupted. So 7 years after it was proclaimed a national monument because of its significance as an extinct volcano, it erupted, and it erupted pretty big. And that's sort of funny. The first eruption was in May of 1914, just one eruption. That was a minor one. And then they increased in intensity for about a year. And then the big one happened in May of 1915. And the last one happened in 1917. So it was active for 3 years or more there. So that brought a lot of attention to Lassen.
Pretty good for being an extinct volcano.
Exactly. And Crater Lake could go again, too. Crater Lake, you think of as just a crater, and that was something that happened 7,000 years ago, but it's still potentially could be active.
Because this is one of about 300 volcanoes on that ring of fire, right? That tectonic plate, and you had we had the big 1906 San Francisco earthquake that I think started drawing a lot of attention with geologists, right?
Of course, there's a lot of movement on the Pacific coast.
So those of us who lived through the 80s will remember Mount St. Helens.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I sure do. And one of my biggest regrets in life is not going to watch it explode. I was away at college in Eastern Oregon, and it was finals week of my senior year. And I had a 1953 Ford pickup that wasn't really freeway worthy, and I didn't go to see it. Now, I did get to see it puffing steam and all of that, but the big explosion I missed. Oh. And it's one of those things, looking back on it, that was probably more important than just, senior year finals.
You had your priorities misaligned.
Yep.
Yeah, I think I did at that age, for sure. But anyway, Lassen Volcanic proved them wrong on the idea of an extinct volcano. So there was some opposition to Lassen, people that would have preferred to log it and mine that area. And when it was first proclaimed a forest reserve, which it was in 1905 by Theodore Roosevelt, there were people that were very suspicious of the Forest Service moving in, and people wanted to make sure that it was used for power generation and timber and sawmills and mining and all of that. But after the explosion, after the eruption, there wasn't much more opposition after that.
No.
And so there were a few different bills that were introduced to establish Lassen Volcanic National Park. So finally, the two national monuments that Theodore Roosevelt established and some additional acreage, quite a bit of additional acreage, were put together into Lassen Volcanic National Park.
So this was National Monument number 6 and number 7 for Roosevelt. And as a reminder to our TED heads out there, we understand why it took so long to get these going, because of the Antiquities Act wasn't passed until 1906, right?
Yeah.
That's right. So when you think about Theodore Roosevelt establishing 5 national parks and 18 monuments, it takes an act of Congress for a national park. And in those days, there wasn't always agreement on what constituted quality for a national park. And there were no real standards for parks. And so they were slow in coming at first. And there was no National Park Service either. So it was sort of hit and miss. But once the Antiquities Act was passed, there was more of a channel there for presidents to proclaim parks or monuments, actually. So anyway, today when we look back at Lassen Volcanic, most people think of it as being established in 1916 as a park, which is true. But the two monuments were its basis. They were its foundation. And so Roosevelt should have a lot of credit for those monuments in 1907 because they still make up the core of that very exceptional national park.
Now, were there any, you'd mentioned park champions in the case of Crater Lake. Were there any persons who were really lobbying TR to turn these two into national monuments?
Yeah, there were. There were a lot of local business people that signed petitions and such to have it established. There was no one person that I'm aware of, but there certainly was a lot of local support, and there was also a lot of local opposition. And that's often the case even today with parks. A lot of local support, a lot of local opposition.
I like that they changed their opposition after the eruption, even though it had been an active region through there. I mean, there'd been thermal activity throughout all time with that, but yeah, once it erupts, they give up.
Yeah, the eruption brought so much attention to that place. I mean, there were scientists going out there to study that. There were reporters. There were tourists that wanted to see it. All kinds of people. It was all over the news of the day. And then they thought, oh yeah, this would be a pretty good national park. So those monuments and a bunch of acreage in between became Lassen Volcanic National Park. One other thing that's sort of interesting about Lassen Volcanic is when it became a national park on August 9th, 1916, it was just 16 days later that the National Park Service was established. So these first national parks, there was no National Park Service, and they were managed various ways by the Forest Service and the War Department and different things. But so just 16 days after the establishment of Lassen Volcanic, the National Park Service came into being to manage the parks and monuments.
Wow. So Wilson gets credit for this one.
That's correct. Sometimes, but the basis was, of course, Theodore Roosevelt.
Yes.
All right.
So where do we travel next on our trip along the Pacific coast?
Well, I think later we might make this into an actual little road trip, but our next park is actually Muir Woods National Monument, which is just north of San Francisco. And it's just an amazing place of coastal redwoods, and one that Theodore Roosevelt knew a lot about. This was something that he had had a lot of communication with a man named William Kent, who wanted to protect that area and wanted to protect those redwoods before that area was destroyed for a reservoir. And so Kent worked really hard in 1907 to do everything he needed. He owned this land, and so he wanted to donate it to the federal government to make it a national monument. And he did that. And that was the very first national monument that came from donated lands, donated private lands. And Theodore Roosevelt was all for it, and they talked to each other about it. So Roosevelt was deeply involved in this. He did like redwoods. He had seen the redwoods, not right there, but in other places, and had spoken about them. And so when Kent offered to donate the land, he was all for that. He even wanted to name a portion of it Kent Woods after Mr. Kent, but Mr. Kent said that he had 5 sons who could carry on his name. And if they couldn't do it, he certainly didn't need a park to be named that. So actually William Kent wanted it to be Muir Woods, named after Roosevelt's friend, John Muir.
So he's just somebody who just simply admired John Muir for his accomplishments and what he stood for in the Sierra Club, and even though he's a Chicago businessman. I looked up the amount that he had paid for it. I guess he purchased this tract of land expressly to be able to donate it over, but I saw he paid $45,000 for this land in 1905, and I did the math, and it works out to be about $1.5 million in today's dollars. So money well spent. Anybody who goes to San Francisco, I have to admit this is one of my favorite little parks in the entire park system that I have visited, at least, and it's just an incredibly special place. It's not even really that big, but it's just within a half an hour north of San Francisco, and just an amazing little redwood sanctuary there.
It is, and the National Park Service has to ensure that not too many people are there at the same time because they want to maintain the quiet there. They ask people to maintain quiet, to think of it as a sanctuary. So it's not the kind of park where you're out playing ball or running around. No. It's more of a place to stroll and take in the feeling of the redwoods and the moist woodlands there.
That's how John Muir felt about the woods. It was better than any cathedral.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. My wife and I last went there just post-COVID, and because you have to make a reservation for it now, and there's very limited parking, as you said, we got in the first reservation of the day at 8 a.m. and it was a weekday, and turns out we literally had the place to ourselves for the first hour and a half. Just was surreal experience to have no other person there and no words spoken. Very special.
I was there once on Christmas Day, and I couldn't believe how many people were spending their Christmas Day wandering quietly through Muir Woods.
Yeah. Roosevelt said a grove of giant redwoods or sequoias should be kept just as we keep a great or beautiful cathedral.
It's a special place for sure. There are other redwood parks in California, state and federal. So there's a small percentage of the original redwoods left, the coastal redwoods, but fortunately, because of those thoughts, I think some of those other parks followed in that vein. I mean, Theodore Roosevelt didn't establish Redwood National Park or Redwood State Parks, but certainly his vision carried forth so that there are a number of parks, state and federal parks, that protect the coastal redwoods in California.
Yeah, I think California is really to be commended for all of the tremendous number. There's about 4 state parks, I think, dedicated to the redwoods along the coast there in California. Okay, so shall we press on chronologically here, staying still in Central California there? What's our next national monument?
Our next one is Pinnacles National Monument, and that was actually just a few days after Muir Woods in January of 1908 as well.
And what makes this place special?
The scenery at Pinnacles is unique. So the way that the formations are coming up out of the forest. There's some high peaks there, and then forests down below. And in that area, even though it's so close to huge population centers, with 10 million people in the San Francisco Bay Area, it's within 150 miles of 10 million people. It's just kind of tucked away in the Salinas Valley there, in the Bear Valley. And so you don't realize that you're anywhere near all of that population. It feels like what some people call old California. So it's got an interesting and unique, I would say, feel. It's really a great place for hiking and birding. There's a lot of special geology. There's some caves. And more recently, California condors have been reestablished there. And that's one of the easiest places to go, and if you have a little bit of patience, to see California condors, which were once nearly extinct, flying around in the evenings and such. And you can climb a trail to the high peaks and sometimes even get a closer look of a condor, which is really amazing if you can do that. So Pinnacles National Monument, again, as we mentioned, was established in 1908, but it achieved national park status in 2013. So it's one of those that's often listed as one of the newer national parks, but it's not really new. It just had a change of name and some boundary changes. And so it's interesting because the general public often makes a big distinction between national parks and national monuments. But the National Park Service does not. They don't have a great difference in how they're managed or funded or maintained. It's really just a matter of how they were formed. It takes an act of Congress to make a national park. Now, there are some national monuments that will never be national parks because they're too small or they don't really meet the criteria. But a lot of these larger national monuments, including some that Theodore Roosevelt established, even in the Grand Canyon, were originally monuments, and then Congress changed them to national parks. And so Pinnacles is one of the more recent parks that was changed from a monument to a park in 2013.
And it's a little bit off the beaten track, but not too bad. It's Steinbeck country there, right in Central California, and you kind of got to be on your way to Pinnacles to see it. But it's one of the great advantages of national monuments. Speaking of that, is there's less visitation, certainly, because people, as you said, put all this priority on wanting to visit actual parks.
I think so. I think a lot of people do kind of concentrate on the 63 national parks instead of the 430 some national park areas. Now, my personal goal is to go to every single national park area, and I'm at about 367 now. I think it's 431. I may be off by one or two.
Wow.
So I'm making good progress. I still have a ways to go. Pinnacles had a lot of things in their archives. It took a long time to go through their archives there because it was a strange mix of proclamation and laws and signatures that came into making that national monument. And Theodore Roosevelt was a big part of that. So with Gifford Pinchot, in July of 1906, they established the Pinnacles Forest Reserve. So just before that, in June of 1906, the Antiquities Act was passed. But a month later, they still made it a forest reserve. But then it seemed like, it would be good as a national monument. So in 1908, Roosevelt proclaimed Pinnacles National Monument, which was 2,080 acres. And it was in the middle of the forest reserve. And that caused some confusion. So after a while, it's like, we have this monument in the middle of the forest. And so they abolished the forest reserve. And then there were a large number of subsequent proclamations and redesignations and boundary changes and expansions. And then finally that name change in 2013. And there were numerous presidents involved over the years. So it was kind of a convoluted beginning, but it sure has come out well now for the current public to enjoy, and as a great habitat for plants and wildlife, including the still endangered but recovering California condor.
Yeah, any chance our listeners get to ever see a condor in flight, that's something not to be missed.
That's for sure. And the park now is 26,000 acres, and it has so much diversity. And it is pretty easy to camp there and maybe see a condor. I've also seen them in Arizona, in the Vermilion Cliffs area. Mm-hmm. But Pinnacles is a great place to see them flying above.
All right. So where do we head to next in our chronological discussion of Theodore Roosevelt's parks?
Well, our last park is back in Washington, and that was Mount Olympus National Monument, which Roosevelt proclaimed in 1909. And what's interesting about that is that it was one day before he left office, if I'm not mistaken. His term was up the next day. Yeah. And so on March 3rd, 1909, he established that national monument. And the Olympic National Monument that he established was fairly large, and it included a lot of native forest. And after that, a lot of things happened to it. There were other presidents that came and tried to diminish the national monument that Theodore Roosevelt established. So he originally established it as 610,560 acres within a national forest, and it was managed by the Forest Service. But then when William Howard Taft came along, he reduced the size of the monument by a little bit. And then Woodrow Wilson, he reduced the size of the monument by nearly half because of objections from the timber industry. And he eliminated large parts of the marketable forest from the national monument. And then Coolidge eliminated more of it and reduced the size of the monument even further. So at that point, the people who cared about this amazing place were very concerned about Mount Olympus National Monument and what was going to happen to it, because so much of it had been taken away. And local residents were probably on both sides of that argument. Some of them thought it was good that more of the forest would be used. Others were very concerned that the monument was not being preserved properly. But the old growth forests really were spectacular. And so some wanted to harvest them and some wanted to save them. And that often happens today too. But there were conservationists that were very concerned and said, as established by President Theodore Roosevelt, it would have been a splendid national park in itself. But it has been trimmed down in order to eliminate the magnificent primeval forest, which was its most unique and one of its grandest features, to open it up to lumbering. And so who saved Mount Olympus was actually Franklin D. Roosevelt. When he came along, he transferred the management of the national monuments to the National Park Service, because the National Park Service had been established in 1916. And Franklin Roosevelt went to the Olympic Peninsula, and he had this vision. He wanted to provide for the people who lived in the area, but he also wanted to provide for the people 50 years in the future or 100 years in the future. And so he established it as Olympic National Park through an act of Congress, which also allowed him to increase the size of it in the future. And so after he signed the park into existence, he did what Congress said he could do. He added another 187,000 plus acres to it. And the next year he added some more acres in 1943. Truman then followed suit, and he added even more of the forest to the park in 1953. So today, this park, Olympic National Park, is 922,000 plus acres. Wow. And it includes this old growth forest, which is so important. It has the whole rainforest, the temperate rainforest. It has the high mountain peaks. And it has 70 miles of coastline now that's a little bit separated from the rest of the park, but along the ocean there. And so it's so diverse. It has something for everyone. There are beautiful lakes. There's a hot spring. There are these old growth forests. There are high mountain peaks if you want to climb or hike up in the mountains. And then there's a rainforest. And the Roosevelt elk is also there. That's a subspecies of elk that was originally called the Olympic elk, but was later changed to the Roosevelt elk. And Roosevelt elk are found in a fairly limited area, ranging from the Olympic Peninsula down to Redwood National Park in California, that area.
Yeah, I was reading in Doug Brinkley's Wilderness Warrior that it was this designation of the Roosevelt elk by T.R.'s friend C. Hart Merriam in the late 1890s that really spurred his interest in the fauna and flora and the birds of the Pacific Northwest. And just the more he read about the area, the more he fell in love with it and became more determined to one day maybe try to save and preserve it. So yeah, that's a really neat story that it's FDR then that gets credit for restoring what was TR's original vision for the park, right?
Yeah. So if you ask someone today, they'd probably say, "Oh yeah, Franklin D. Roosevelt established this park in 1938 or whatever." But actually, again, like with the Lassen Volcanic National Park, it really was Theodore Roosevelt who got it all started as Mount Olympus National Monument.
Roosevelt got the assist on that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. I think that was kind of a neat thing, that it took two Roosevelts to really make this park happen and to make it the way it is today. You mentioned about how would you do this as a road trip? Uh-huh. And I'm a big travel planner and a big road tripper myself. So I thought about that, and I think you could easily do this, and it wouldn't, it always depends on how much time you spend in a park, right? Some people think they can drive through Yellowstone in 4 hours and they've seen it. Oh. And then other people feel like, well, I need a month to see Yellowstone. So it really depends on the person. But you could easily start a trip at Olympic National Park. Go to Seattle, however you get there, maybe drive, maybe fly. But you could start at Olympic National Park. And then it's really not too far to go down to Crater Lake. And then it's not really that far. You have to take a little detour to go over to Lassen. And then you could see Lassen Peak and Cinder Cone national monuments. And then you could head down to San Francisco to see Muir Woods and finish off with Pinnacles. Fly out of San Jose. That would be a pretty good mostly linear road trip, I'd say. But it does take some time to see these parks, and people really do need to plan because, the road that goes through Lassen Volcanic is closed much of the year due to snow. So it closes sometime between September and November, and it opens between May and July. And the year I was there around the 4th of July. The road was still closed. They still had not just snow plows, but bulldozers out to move huge piles of snow just so they could get the plows through. And it never opened that year until July 8th.
Huh.
So you never know. And Crater Lake isn't too different. It has a little longer season, but it's got a lot of snow. The first time I ever went to Crater Lake was right before I went to college. And it was August, and it snowed on us. And that was a big deal. I had never seen it snow in August before. But my first trip to Crater Lake, it did.
Yeah. I was just following along here on the map as you were talking about that road trip and thinking, man, that's a trip to take. And there's so many other national parks out west as well that just taking that road trip, you're going to run into multiple other national parks along the way or national monuments.
Yeah. I mean,
Well, you could get really
show national forest. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, well, there's so many public lands, but I mean, Washington alone has portions of 15 national park areas. Oregon, not as many, and California, way more. So you could get really diverted, and then it wouldn't be a very easy trip.
Yeah.
But if you stuck with Roosevelt's parks and monuments, or the monuments that have become parks, it would be a pretty good road trip.
I was just curious. You were talking about what would there be, at least 100 that you haven't visited yet in the park system?
Well, I think more like 65.
Okay, so all right, 65.
Yeah.
That's really not very much. What's on the bucket list still that you're really looking forward to that you haven't been to yet?
Well, some of the remote parks in Alaska I've not yet been to, and there are a number of small battlefield parks and such in the southeast U.S. That makes up most of the parks that I've not been to.
Mm-hmm.
I've been to nearly all western parks, although there are a few I've not, but not very many.
Mm-hmm.
And a number in Alaska and all of Hawaii, and also the territories. I've been to all the national parks well, there's only one in Puerto Rico, but Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, American Samoa, and Guam.
Mm-hmm.
I've been to all the national parks in those areas. So I really am just focusing in on one here and there that I've missed.
I think we're a little bit jealous about that, but
Yes. I am. Now that I'm retired, I'm looking forward to maybe making those trips. So
yeah.
If you need a travel planner, let me know.
Oh, I will.
I love to plan
Julia's-
trips to national parks.
Julia's the planner. I'm more of the fly by seat of pants type person. So
Well, this will kind of wrap up our part one in the TR Parks series with Valerie Naylor. So, Valerie, you want to let folks know what we'll be talking about in part two?
In part two, we will talk about all of the parks and monuments that Theodore Roosevelt established in the southwestern U.S. So we'll be looking at Arizona, New Mexico, and a few other areas. Many of the parks in Arizona and New Mexico are cultural parks and are very important in that standpoint. Of course, we'll talk about the Grand Canyon as well. Once a national monument that many people didn't want established. And now, of course, one of the most popular of the national parks. So we'll go to the Southwest next, and then we'll move north and cover some more of his parks. All of his parks and monuments were in the western U.S. There wasn't anything east.
Yeah. Sorry, Larry. Living in Ohio, this doesn't help you out, does it?
I know.
Well, thanks so much, Valerie. That was great having you back on to talk about Teddy again and talking about a subject that I know is near and dear to your heart.
Yes.
Thank you. It's always fun.
Well, that's our show for today. Thanks for listening.
You can find this podcast on our website, talkaboutteddy.com, where you can see show notes and transcripts, links to resources, and additional TR content. And please tell us what you think.
If you've enjoyed our content, please consider subscribing and reviewing the podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and family about it, because it really does make a tremendous difference and it helps others find this show.
We hope you'll join us for the next episode of Talk About Teddy. And until then, as our friend Colonel Roosevelt would say,
do what you can with what you have where you are.
bullet.